Susanna Idu sat cross-legged on her bed, the soft glow of her bedside lamp illuminating the crisp white paper in her hands. Her acceptance letter to Lagos's most prestigious nursing school felt like a golden ticket, a passport to the life she had dreamed of. She had read it at least 50 times, yet the words still made her heart race with excitement. 2 trials, 2 rejections, countless nights of tears and frustration. And now, at 22, she had finally broken through. She whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, clutching the letter to her chest. This was her last chance, and she had made it. Her thoughts drifted to her father, Mr. James Idu, the man who had been her anchor since they lost her mother. Life had been unbearably hard for him, yet he had never once let her feel the full weight of their struggles. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificing his own comfort just to make sure she had food on her plate and a roof over her head. Susanna felt a lump rise in her throat. Finally, she could see a future where she would take care of him the way he had always taken care of her. Once she became a nurse, she would earn enough to ease his burdens. No more late nights worrying about bills, no more silent sacrifices. It was her turn to give back. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She quickly folded the letter and placed it carefully on her bed. "Come in," she called, wiping at her eyes before her father could see her getting too emotional. The door creaked open, and there he stood, her father, looking as weary yet determined as ever. "It's time to go," he said softly. Susanna nodded and reached for her trainers, slipping them on quickly. Tonight was important. They were going to visit one of her father's old friends, a man who had promised to lend them some money. Money that would cover her school fees and help with expenses at home. Her father picked up his backpack from the floor, his movements slow, almost hesitant. She noticed him glance at her acceptance letter before he quietly reached for it and slipped it into his bag. She frowned slightly. "Daddy, why did you take that?" He gave her a small smile. "Evidence, my daughter, so he can see how much we need the money." It made sense. She exhaled and nodded, brushing off the slight unease that had settled in her stomach. Her father had always done what was best for her, always made decisions with her future in mind. As they stepped out of their small apartment into the cool night air, Susanna clutched her bag tightly. The streets were dimly lit, with only a few passers-by moving about. The distant sounds of traffic hummed in the background as they made their way toward the main road. They walked in silence, Susanna occasionally glancing at her father. His face looked more tired than usual, lines of exhaustion etched deeply into his skin. She knew he worked too hard and worried too much. She wanted to say something to reassure him that their struggles would soon be over. But before she could find the right words, he raised his hand to flag down a taxi. A yellow cab pulled over, and her father leaned in slightly. "Take us to Victoria Island," he said. Susanna's stomach twisted slightly. Victoria Island? That was unusual. They had never gone there before, at least not for something like this. She hesitated for a moment before climbing into the back seat beside her father. As the taxi pulled into the road, she stared out of the window, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Something about tonight didn't feel right. The drive to Victoria Island was long and quiet. Susanna leaned against the window, watching the bright city lights blur past. She had always admired this part of Lagos, the perfectly paved roads, the towering glass buildings, the luxury cars that zoomed past as though they owned the streets. It was a stark contrast to the modest neighborhood she had grown up in. Her father sat beside her, staring straight ahead, deep in thought. His grip on his backpack was firm, his knuckles slightly tense. Something about his silence unsettled her, but she pushed the feeling aside. They were here to get help, nothing more. The taxi slowed as they entered a highbrow estate lined with magnificent mansions. Susanna's eyes widened slightly as they pulled up in front of an imposing black gate with golden accents. It was the kind of house she had only seen in movies, grand, intimidating, and screaming of wealth. Her father exhaled deeply, then stepped out of the taxi. Susanna followed, clutching her bag tighter. A small security booth stood beside the gate, and a guard in a neatly pressed uniform stepped forward. "Who are you here to see?" the guard asked in a professional tone, his eyes scanning them both with calculated suspicion. Her father adjusted his stance before responding. Mr. James Idu, we have an appointment with Mr. Jayson Oputa. At the mention of the name, the guard's expression flickered slightly. He eyed them for a few seconds before pressing a button, and the heavy gate slowly slid open. This way, he gestured, stepping aside to let them in. Susanna's heart pounded as they walked into the grand compound. Everything about the place oozed power and affluence. The marble driveway, the high columns supporting the mansion, the glowing chandeliers visible through the massive glass windows. As they stepped into the luxurious foyer, two heavily built men emerged from a hallway. Dressed in fitted black suits, they stood with their arms crossed, their broad chests and rigid posture making it clear that they were bodyguards. One of them looked directly at her father. "Sit down, I will get the boss." Susanna hesitated before slowly lowering herself onto a plush leather couch. The entire place smelled of expensive cologne and polished wood, and it made her feel small, insignificant. She stole a glance at her father, but his expression was unreadable. Minutes passed, and then the sound of footsteps echoed from the grand staircase. Susanna looked up, and her breath caught. Descending from the staircase was a man who could easily be mistaken for a celebrity. Tall, with broad shoulders, and a strikingly handsome face, he had the aura of someone who commanded attention without trying. His dark eyes were sharp, intelligent, and dangerously unreadable. He couldn't have been more than his early 30s. Susanna's brows furrowed. This was her father's friend? She had expected an older man, someone her father's age, with graying hair and a weary smile. But this man, Jayson Oputa, was young, powerful, and exuded confidence that was almost unnerving. No matter, if he was willing to help them, then that was all that mattered. Without a word, Jayson walked towards them, a calculating smirk playing on his lips. Then, with effortless grace, he dropped a black briefcase onto the glass table in front of them. The click of the lock's opening made Susanna lean forward slightly. When Jayson flipped it open, her eyes widened in shock. Neatly stacked bundles of cash filled the briefcase, 20 million naira to be precise. The room was silent. The weight of the money, the meaning behind it, hung thick in the air. Susanna swallowed hard. What exactly had they come here for? The room was silent except for the faint ticking of an expensive-looking clock mounted on the wall. Susanna sat frozen, her eyes flickering between the stacks of money in the briefcase and her father, who had suddenly gone stiff beside her. Then, to her utter shock, he turned to her with tears streaming down his face. Susanna's breath caught in her throat. The only time she had ever seen her father cry was when her mother died. He had always been strong, always swallowed his pain so she wouldn't see it. But now his shoulders shook, his face twisted in sorrow as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Daddy?" she whispered, feeling his body tremble against hers. He held on tighter as if letting go would break him completely. His hands gripped her back, his breath ragged. She could feel his heartbeat pounding against her chest. "Don't be mad at me, Susanna," he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, my daughter, don't hate me for this. I had no choice." Her stomach twisted. What was he talking about? She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with wide, confused eyes. "What do you mean, Daddy? Why are you saying this? Why are you crying?" Her father cupped her face with his rough, calloused hands, the same hands that had worked tirelessly to give her the best life he could manage. His gaze was desperate, pleading. "I have to do this," he murmured, his voice breaking. "I need to start over. I need to live too." He let out a shaky breath. "But you have to forgive me." Susanna's chest tightened, panic beginning to rise. "Forgive you for what?" Her father didn't answer. Instead, he gently brushed his thumb over her cheek, his eyes memorizing her face as if he was seeing her for the last time. Then in one slow motion, he released her, stepped back, and dropped the backpack he had been carrying from home. The heavy bag hit the floor with a dull thud, but her father didn't even glance at it. Instead, he reached for the briefcase, the one filled with 20 million naira. "Daddy?" Susanna's voice wavered. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. He picked up the briefcase and turned toward the door, his movements slow, deliberate. He hesitated for just a moment, looking at her one last time, his face filled with unspeakable pain. And then he walked away. "Daddy!" Susanna gasped, scrambling to her feet. She tried to rush after him, but a firm hand grabbed her arm, stopping her in her tracks. She whipped her head around, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. One of the bodyguards, his expression unreadable, held her back. Her father was still walking. He didn't turn around. She fought against the grip holding her, panic now turning to terror. "Daddy, wait! Where are you going? Don't leave me here!" But he didn't stop. He was leaving. And Susanna had no idea why Susanna's heart pounded violently in her chest as she broke into a run. Her father was only a few steps ahead, his figure retreating toward the door with a briefcase full of money in his hands. "Daddy, wait!" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. She barely made it 2 steps before 2 guards stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "No!" she screamed, trying to push past them, her hands slamming against their solid chests. "Move! Let me go to my father!" But they didn't budge. A slow, amused voice cut through her panic. "Stop worrying yourself," Jayson Oputa said coolly. "Your father just sold you to me." Susanna whipped around, her eyes burning with rage and disbelief. "What?" Jayson leaned against the arm of the plush leather chair, watching her like a predator observing its prey. His gaze was calm, almost too relaxed, as if none of this was out of the ordinary. She shook her head furiously. "That's impossible. I am not something to be sold. I am priceless." A smirk tugged at the corner of Jayson's lips. "You may think so," he said smoothly, "but your father disagrees. He put a price on you, and I paid it." The words sent a cold shiver through Susanna's spine. Her knees felt weak, her body trembling with shock. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't happening. This isn't real. He wouldn't do this to me." "Yet here you are," Jayson said indifferently, flicking imaginary dust off his sleeve. Susanna's breath came in short gasps. "Let me go. This is illegal. I am a human being, not a piece of property." She turned back toward the door, her fists clenched. But before she could take another step, one of the guards lunged forward, grabbing her effortlessly. "No, let me go!" she screamed, thrashing violently. Man, it was useless. The man was built like a wall of solid rock. With terrifying ease, he lifted her up and threw her over his shoulder like she weighed nothing. Susanna pounded her fists against his back, kicking and screaming, but he didn't react. He carried her up the grand staircase, her screams echoing through the mansion. "Put me down!" she shrieked. "Jayson, you can't do this!" Jayson didn't respond. He simply watched with a neutral expression as the bodyguard hauled her down the hallway. They reached a large, luxurious bedroom, and before she could scream again, the guard dumped her onto the soft mattress and stepped out, locking the door behind him. Susanna lunged toward the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was locked in. Her chest heaved as she spun around, taking in the room a prison disguised as paradise. The walls were painted a soft shade of cream, the bed was enormous, and a crystal chandelier dangled from the ceiling. A vanity table stood in the corner, and a walk-in closet with expensive-looking doors was visible on the other side. But it wasn't home. It was a cage. Tears streamed down her face as she sank onto the bed, clutching her arms around herself. How could her father do this? How could he betray her like this? A slight creak made her snap her head toward the door. Jayson stood just outside, holding an envelope between his fingers. Without a word, he tossed it inside the room, letting it land on the floor. "What is that?" she choked out. Jayson's face remained unreadable. "A letter from your father." Then he shut the door. Susanna's fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. Her father's familiar handwriting was scrawled across the front. With a deep breath, she tore it open and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Susanna, I know you must hate me right now, and I deserve it. There are no words that can explain what I have done, but I beg you to forgive me. I was desperate. I had no choice. I made a promise to your mother, to protect you, to take care of you. But I have failed. I have nothing left to give you, my daughter. You deserve more than the life I could ever offer. And there is something you must know. I am not your real father. I raised you. I loved you like my own. But the truth is, you were never mine by blood. Your real father, he is someone else. Someone I could never tell you about. I am sorry, Susanna. I pray that one day you will forgive me. No matter what happens, please remember, I will always love you. Forever, James Idu. The paper slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor. Susanna's vision blurred, her breath shallow. Not her real father? Everything was happening too fast. Her chest ached, her world spun, and before she could process it all, darkness swallowed her, and she lost consciousness. Susanna lay still on the massive bed, her face peaceful yet fragile, her breathing slow and steady. She had been unconscious for nearly 2 days. Jayson Oputa sat beside her, one elbow resting on his knee as he watched her in silence. His dark eyes traced the delicate curve of her face, her full lips, the soft rise and fall of her chest. She was breathtaking. Her lush black hair spilled over the pillows, framing her face like a halo. Even now, weakened and lost in slumber, she glowed. Her skin, deep, rich, and smooth, looked like polished ebony under the dim lighting. There was an effortless beauty about her, one that required no adornment. Jayson had been with many women, but none had captivated him the way this one did, and he hadn't even spoken a full conversation with her yet. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thick dark hair. This was not what he had expected when he struck the deal with James Idu. When the older man came begging for financial assistance, Jayson had listened, not out of pity, but because he was curious. It was rare for a man to walk into his space and offer his own daughter in exchange for money. Jayson had made it clear he did not give out money for free. If people wanted something from him, they had to pay a price. And James Idu had been willing to pay the highest price possible. Jayson leaned back against the headboard, his jaw tightening as he remembered that night. "She is all I have," James had said, his voice trembling. "She's the only thing of value in my life." Jayson had tilted his head, observing the desperate man before him. He was used to people groveling, but this was different. This was a father offering up his own blood. "If she's the only thing you have, why are you so willing to give her away?" James had swallowed hard, his face pale. "Because she deserves more than I can ever give her." Jayson had leaned forward, resting his hands on the glass table between them. "I don't do charity, Mr. Idu. If I give you money, I expect something of equal value in return." "She is of value," James had said quickly, reaching into his bag. "My daughter is beautiful, well-educated, and hardworking. She will be a good woman to you. She will obey you." Jayson had raised a brow at that. "You're offering her as what? A servant?" James had flinched. "A wife, a companion, anything you want her to be." That had made Jayson pause. He had heard of desperate men before, but this was something else. And then James slid a small photo album across the table. Jayson smirked slightly at the memory. The moment he saw her pictures, he knew. He knew he wanted her. He had flipped through the pages looking at images of a smiling young woman with hopeful eyes, a face untouched by cruelty or deceit. She was the kind of woman men wanted to protect, but she had been handed over like a mere possession. Jayson hadn't hesitated. 20 million naira. That was the price her father had set, and he had paid it. His eyes flickered back to Susanna's still form. He hadn't expected her to react the way she did. He thought she would rage, cry, maybe even beg. But instead, she had broken. Her mind had shattered from the betrayal, her body giving in to exhaustion. And now, for the first time in years, Jayson Oputa found himself unsettled. This woman, this girl who was now his, had turned out to be more than he had bargained for. The room was silent, except for the sound of Susanna's slow, steady breathing. Jayson sat beside her, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on the armrest of the chair. He had never been the type to sit still, but something about watching her sleep had held him captive for longer than he intended. A sharp knock on the door broke his thoughts. He turned his head, irritation flashing in his dark eyes. The door opened slightly, and one of his most trusted bodyguards, Felix, stepped in. His expression was serious, his posture rigid. "Sir," Felix said in a low tone, "we caught them." Jayson's eyes darkened instantly. His entire demeanor shifted from relaxed to lethal in a matter of seconds. Without a word, he rose from the bed, taking one last glance at Susanna before walking out of the room. Felix trailed behind him as they made their way down the long, grand staircase and into the lower part of the mansion, the part few people ever saw. The air in the dimly lit basement was thick with the stench of blood and sweat. Two men knelt in the middle of the room, their faces swollen, their bodies beaten beyond recognition. Their hands were tied behind their backs, their clothes torn and soaked in their own blood. Jayson stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His sharp gaze assessed them with cold calculation. They were already half dead, but that was not enough. Not yet. "You know," he began, his tone almost conversational, "I never understand why people think they can steal from me and get away with it." Neither man spoke. Their heavy breathing and groans filled the air. Jayson crouched in front of them, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me, why did you do it?" Still silence. Jayson smirked. He already knew how this would go. In their world, men like them didn't break easily. But he loved making them break. With a nod to one of his men, a metal tray was brought forward. A pair of pliers gleamed under the single bulb illuminating the room. He picked it up slowly, admiring the weight of it in his hands before turning back to the kneeling men. "Since you don't want to talk," he said smoothly, "I'll help you find your voice." Before either of them could react, Jayson gripped the hand of the man closest to him and, without hesitation, clamped the pliers onto his pinky finger. The man gasped, his entire body going rigid. Jayson gave him a second, a moment of false hope, and then he squeezed. A sickening crack filled the room. A blood-curdling scream tore through the air as the man convulsed in pain, his body trembling violently. Jayson barely flinched. He simply dropped the mangled piece of flesh onto the floor and moved to the next finger. "Why did you steal from me?" he asked again, his voice eerily calm. The man sobbed but still said nothing. Jayson sighed, gripping the pliers again. He was just about to move to the next finger when a loud, piercing scream echoed from the stairs. Jayson's head snapped up, his entire body tensed. It was her, Susanna. Susanna stood frozen on the staircase, her entire body trembling. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. She had followed the sound of voices, curious about what was happening. But nothing could have prepared her for what she had just witnessed. Jayson Oputa, the man who had bought her, had just crushed another man's pinky finger with a pair of pliers. The sickening sound of bone snapping, the agonized screams, the blood dripping onto the floor, it was too much. A horrified scream tore from her throat before she could stop it. Jayson's head snapped up instantly. Their eyes met, hers wide with terror, his dark and unreadable. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to move, racing up the stairs as fast as she could. Her breath came in short gasps, panic clawing at her throat. She slammed the bedroom door shut behind her and pressed her back against it, her hands shaking violently. What had she just seen? Her body trembled as she clutched her arms around herself. A horrifying realization settled in her chest like a stone. This man was dangerous. He was capable of hurting her, just as easily as he had hurt that man. Her entire body jerked when a loud bang came from the door. "Susanna!" Jayson's voice was firm, but not harsh. "Open the door." She squeezed her eyes shut. No, she couldn't. More banging. "Susanna." His tone was calm, but she could hear the restrained irritation in it. "Open the door." "Go away!" she yelled, her voice cracking. A deep sigh. Then after a pause, "Bring the spare key." Her heart nearly stopped. No, no, no. Moments later, she heard the distinct click of the lock being undone. Before she could react, the door swung open and Jayson stepped inside. Her breath caught in her throat. He was too close. The dim lighting in the room cast shadows across his sharp features. His dark eyes locked onto her as he slowly stepped forward. And then she snapped. With everything inside her, she lifted her hand and slapped him across the face. A sharp sound echoed through the room. Jayson didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He simply stood there, his face turned slightly from the force of her slap. Susanna's chest rose and fell rapidly. "How cruel can you be?" she choked out, her voice filled with disgust. Slowly, Jayson turned his face back to her, his expression unreadable. He let out a quiet breath, his fingers flexing at his sides. Then, with terrifying calmness, he simply said, "This is what I do. They need to know I'm not weak." Susanna's stomach twisted with fear and revulsion. Who had she been sold to? Susanna collapsed onto the bed, her body shaking as fresh tears spilled from her eyes. Her whole world had shattered in a matter of days. First, her father had sold her. Then she had discovered he wasn't even her real father. And now she had just witnessed the terrifying cruelty of the man who owned her. Jayson Oputa, the man who had snapped another's finger without blinking. The man who spoke of power and fear as if they were the only things that mattered. And now she was trapped in his world. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Jayson stood beside her, his jaw tightening as he watched her fall apart. He hated seeing her like this. He didn't know why, but something about her tears unsettled him. "Don't cry," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. "This is who I am, Susanna." She shook her head, refusing to look at him. "You're a monster," she whispered brokenly. Jayson stiffened. A monster. That was what people called him. Ruthless, dangerous, cruel. He had never cared before, but hearing it from her, it stung. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. "You need to understand something, Susanna," he said, taking a step closer. "In my world, weakness gets you killed. If I let them steal from me and walk away, I might as well put a bullet in my own head." She still didn't look at him, her shoulders trembling. Jayson's patience was thinning. He had never needed anyone to accept him before, but something about Susanna made him crave. Something. And then before he even knew what he was doing, he was standing right in front of her. She looked up just as he reached for her face, his fingers tilting her chin up. Her lips were soft, trembling slightly under his gaze, and then he kissed her. It was sudden, unexpected. His lips moved against hers with confidence, but there was something else too, something raw, something neither of them understood. Susanna's breath hitched. It felt good, too good. For a brief moment she forgot who he was. She forgot where she was. She forgot everything except the way her body reacted to his touch, the warmth that spread through her like wildfire. And then guilt slammed into her like a wave. What was she doing? This man had bought her like an object. He was the reason she was here. He was cruel, heartless. How could she enjoy this? Her eyes flew open, and before she could stop herself, she slapped him. Again, a sharp smack echoed through the room. Jayson straightened slowly, blinking in disbelief. She had slapped him again. A slow, dangerous silence settled between them. Susanna's chest rose and fell, her hands still tingling from the impact. Jayson exhaled sharply. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but deliberate. He shut the door behind him quietly, not slamming it, not breaking anything in anger. Just quiet. Back in his room, Jayson paced back and forth, his fists clenched. Why? Why didn't he feel the need to hurt her for slapping him? No one had ever dared to put their hands on him like that. No one. He had built his empire on fear, on power. People begged for his mercy. But she stood up to him, and instead of making him furious, it intrigued him. Why? He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to feeling. And it annoyed him. Just as he was about to pour himself a drink, His phone rang. Jayson grabbed it, his jaw tightening when he saw the caller ID. "What?" he snapped. "Sir, one of the warehouses is on fire." Jason's expression darkened instantly. "I'm on my way," he said coldly. Grabbing his jacket, he stormed out of the room, his mind no longer on Susanna. For now. The air around the burning warehouse was thick with smoke, the night sky painted in an eerie orange glow. Jayson Oputa stepped out of his car, his jaw clenched as he surveyed the scene before him. His men were already there, some shouting orders, others trying to assess the damage. But something felt off. Jayson narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just a fire. The way the flames had spread, the way the gates had been left ajar was a setup. He turned to Felix, his most trusted guard. "Get the men ready. Something's wrong." Before Felix could respond, gunfire erupted. An ambush. Shouts filled the air as masked men emerged from the shadows, their weapons flashing under the fire's glow. Jayson moved quickly, pulling out his gun as bullets whizzed past him. His men retaliated, and soon the warehouse became a battleground. Jayson ducked behind a stack of crates, firing precisely at one of the attackers. He never missed, but there were too many of them. Felix was beside him, taking down anyone who got too close. Blood splattered, bodies dropped, but the attackers were relentless. A sharp pain tore through Jason's left arm. He gritted his teeth, looking down to see a knife buried in his flesh. For a moment, the world spun. But Jayson Oputa was not a man who gave in to pain. He grabbed the handle of the blade and yanked it out, blood pouring down his sleeve. Felix grabbed him. "Sir, we have to go." Jayson looked around. His men were falling. The warehouse was lost. If he stayed, he wouldn't make it out alive. Cursing under his breath, he and Felix fought their way back to the car. Bullets shattered the windows as they sped away, leaving behind a burning empire. Jayson had lost this round, but whoever did this would pay. Susanna sat in the kitchen, poking at her plate of rice absent-mindedly. She had woken up with a sharp hunger gnawing at her stomach. It took her a few minutes to gather the courage to leave her room, but when she reached the kitchen, she met Madame Agnes, the elderly housekeeper. At first, Susanna had kept her guard up, but something about the way the woman spoke, soft yet firm, made her relax. "Eat, my dear," Madame Agnes had said warmly, placing a plate in front of her. "You need strength, and I can tell you haven't eaten in days." Susanna hesitated, then took a bite. It was the best thing she had tasted in a long time. She had gotten halfway through her meal when the kitchen door burst open. Jayson walked in, a bloody, disheveled, half-conscious Jayson. The room froze. Madame Agnes gasped and immediately rushed to him, but Jayson raised a weak hand, silently stopping her. His sharp eyes flickered towards Susanna for just a second before he turned away, stumbling slightly. Susanna's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what had happened to him, but she could see the deep gash on his arm, the blood soaking through his shirt. He was hurt. Badly. Before she could think, the words left her mouth. "I can help you stitch that." The entire room stilled. Madame Agnes looked at her in shock. Felix, who had followed Jayson in, raised a brow. Even Jayson himself hesitated, his head tilting slightly in surprise. Susanna swallowed, unsure why she had just said that. But one thing was clear. Everything had just changed. Susanna hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, wrapping an arm around Jayson's waist. He was heavier than she expected, his body tense with exhaustion and pain, but he allowed her to guide him up the grand staircase without protest. Each step felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been terrified of this man, and she still was. But something about seeing him like this, wounded, vulnerable, made her forget, just for a second, the fear she had carried in her chest since she arrived. They reached his bedroom and she helped him into a chair beside his massive bed. He let out a low groan as he sank into the seat, but his intense gaze never left her. Susanna shifted under his stare. Why was he looking at her like that? Finally, she crossed her arms. "This isn't a staring competition," she said sharply. "Tell me where the damn first aid kit is." A smirk, weak but present, touched his lips. Even in pain, he still had the audacity to be amused. Instead of answering, Jayson tilted his head. "Why are you helping me?" Susanna clenched her jaw. "Because I can't watch someone suffer and not assist," she snapped. "Now where is the damn kit before you bleed to death?" Jayson exhaled slowly, his gaze softening just a little. He nodded toward the bathroom. "Under the sink." Without another word, she rushed to get it. As she rummaged through the cabinet, her mind flickered to the few times her late mother, a nurse, had taught her how to handle wounds. She had learned by watching, memorizing every movement. And with her own desire to be a nurse, she had done extra research online. She could do this. Returning with the kit, she knelt beside Jayson, her hands surprisingly steady. "This will sting," she warned. "I can handle pain," he muttered. Susanna ignored him and went to work, cleaning the wound, stopping the bleeding, stitching him up. The room was silent, save for his occasional sharp intakes of breath. He never made a sound of complaint, though. She had to admit his strength was unnerving. By the time she was done, his eyelids were heavy, exhaustion finally taking its toll. She packed the supplies away and stood up, about to leave. But before she could step away, his fingers wrapped around her wrist. She froze. His grip was weak, but firm enough to keep her in place. When she looked down, she was startled to see something unfamiliar in his eyes. Was that vulnerability? "Susanna." His voice was low, almost pleading. "Please, stay." Her breath caught. "Just sit with me," he added. Susanna hesitated. "I just stitched you up, nothing more." A faint, tired smirk. "I know, but just for tonight, sit with me." She narrowed her eyes. "What if I strangle you in your sleep?" Jayson chuckled softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you won't." Before she could say anything else, he was asleep. Susanna stared at him, this dangerous man who had turned her life upside down. She should have left. She should have walked out, let him deal with his own exhaustion. But instead, she sat beside him. And as the night stretched on, she found herself thinking not about his cruelty, but about what her hands on his body had done to her. Susanna stirred slightly, a strange warmth pressing against her back. She hadn't realized she had fallen asleep, but as her consciousness slowly returned, she became aware of a firm grip around her waist. Her breath hitched, a hand holding her. Her body stiffened as her mind caught up with reality, and then she realized it was Jayson. Her pulse quickened. How had this happened? When had he moved? More importantly, why was he holding her like this? She swallowed hard, trying to ignore the odd sensation in her chest. But then she remembered his injuries. He was wounded. He needed rest. Carefully, she slid out of bed, freeing herself from his grip. She had barely taken a step away when his deep, groggy voice broke the silence. "I'm glad you didn't see the need to strangle me in my sleep." Susanna turned slightly, arms crossed over her chest. "You know it isn't late, right?" she shot back, her voice laced with sarcasm. Jayson smirked, his tired eyes glinting with amusement. He shifted slightly but winced, clearly feeling the pain from his wounds. Susanna shook her head and turned toward the door, ready to leave. But just as she reached for the handle, his next words stopped her cold. "Do you know why I took you away from your father?" A lump formed in her throat. She didn't want to hear the answer. Her fingers clenched into a fist as a small sob escaped her lips. "Why?" she whispered. Jayson exhaled slowly, his voice lower than before. "You look exactly like her." Susanna turned back sharply, her brows furrowed. "Like who?" Jason's gaze was distant now, as if he were looking at something or someone that wasn't really there. "My twin sister, Chantel," he murmured. "She died in Italy 10 years ago." Susanna felt the air leave her lungs. Twin sister? She tried to process his words, but nothing made sense. "And when my father came asking for money, you wanted me in exchange?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jayson didn't deny it. He simply nodded. "I want to give you a good life, Susanna. That's all I want." Her body shook with rage, with confusion, with disbelief. "You have no right to do that." Her voice was sharp, cold. "You don't own me, Jayson." But the way he looked at her, the emotion buried deep in his eyes, unnerved her. Because for the first time since she met him, she saw something beyond his cruelty. She saw his pain. Susanna spent the entire day in her room, curled up on her bed, crying until her body felt drained of all energy. How had her life come to this? Just days ago, she had been celebrating her acceptance into nursing school, filled with hope for a bright future. Now she was nothing more than a bargain possession trapped in a world she never asked to be a part of. The weight of Jayson's words from the previous night haunted her. "You look exactly like her." What did that even mean? Was she some kind of replacement? A sharp knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Go away," she snapped, her voice hoarse from all the crying. There was silence for a moment, then a gentle, familiar voice spoke. "Susanna, my dear, please open the door." It was Madame Agnes. "I know you don't want to see anyone right now, and I don't blame you," she continued softly, "but Jayson sent me to bring food for you. If you don't eat, I could lose my job." Susanna remained silent, staring at the ceiling. "Please, child," Madame Agnes pleaded, "at least save my job." A heavy sigh escaped Susanna's lips. Slowly she got up, dragging her feet to the door. She hesitated before unlocking it and cracking it open just enough to take the tray from the older woman's hands. "Thank you," Madame Agnes said, giving her a small, hopeful smile. Susanna didn't respond. She was about to shut the door when something on the tray caught her attention. A small note. Frowning, she picked it up and unfolded it. Jayson's familiar handwriting stared back at her. "Susanna, I know you're so mad at me, and rightfully so, but I'm going to send Felix to bring something to you now. I hope you like it." "Jayson," Susanna scoffed. What was this man up to now? Just as she finished reading, another knock came at her door. She sighed, already knowing who it was. Felix. Reluctantly, she opened the door, and the tall bodyguard handed her a neatly wrapped package. "No one is forcing you to open it," Felix said simply, "but it's from him." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with the box in her hands. Susanna stared at it for a moment before stepping back inside and shutting the door. Slowly, she sat on the edge of her bed and unwrapped the package. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw what was inside. A brand new MacBook, and beside it, the latest iPhone 16 Pro Max. She blinked, completely caught off guard. Her fingers ran over the sleek devices, and for the first time in days, a small, hesitant smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She picked up her spoon and took a bite of the food, realizing just how hungry she actually was. As she ate, she grabbed her iPad and tapped on the screen, pulling up an episode of Prison Break. For a few moments, just a few, she forgot everything else. Jayson sat in his study, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the mahogany desk as he listened to his financial advisor drone on about stock updates, offshore accounts, and investment portfolios. But for the first time in his life, business wasn't his focus. His mind was somewhere else. With her. It had been a day since their fight, since she had slapped him. Twice. Since she had looked him dead in the eye and called him cruel. And he hadn't seen her since. He told himself he didn't care, that she was just another deal he had made, another part of his life he controlled. But then why was he so damn restless? Finally, he had enough. "That's all for now," he muttered, dismissing his team with a wave of his hand. Without another thought, he left his study and walked straight to her room. At her door, he knocked. No answer. A deep frown settled on his face as he tried again. Still nothing. Something felt off. Slowly, he turned the knob, pushing the door open just slightly, and froze. Susanna was curled up on the bed, holding her stomach, her body shaking as she cried softly in pain. His heart slammed against his chest. What the hell was wrong with her? He rushed to her side, his voice unusually frantic. "Susanna, what's wrong?" She turned her head sharply, her face twisted in pain and anger. "Leave me alone, Jayson," she barked, her voice weak but sharp enough to make it flinch. That was when he saw it. The blood, faint but visible, staining the bedsheets. His blood ran cold. His eyes flashed with something dangerous. "What happened?" His voice was sharp, demanding. "Did someone hurt you?" Susanna groaned, gripping her belly even tighter. Without wasting time, he shouted, "Madam Agnes!" The elderly housekeeper rushed in a second later, her face laced with worry. "What happened?" Jayson pointed to the blood, his body radiating tension. "She's bleeding," he said through gritted teeth. "Tell me what's wrong." But instead of panic, Madam Agnes let out a small chuckle. Jason's brow twitched in irritation. "What the hell is funny?" She wiped her hands on her apron and sighed. "Oh, Jayson, it's just her monthly flow." Silence. Jayson blinked. "Her what?" Madam Agnes smiled knowingly. "Her period, sir. That's why she's in pain." For a moment, Jayson was stunned. Then his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he exhaled. He had been ready to kill someone. Regaining his composure, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his black Amex card, and handed it to Madam Agnes. "Get her some chocolate and whatever else she needs." But Madam Agnes just laughed. "That will make her worse, sir." Jayson frowned. "Worse?" She shook her head with amusement. "She needs pads and painkillers, not chocolate." Jayson said nothing, just clenched his jaw and turned back to Susanna, who was still curled up in discomfort. With surprising gentleness, he peeled off her dress, lifting her into his arms. She gasped slightly but was too weak to fight him. He carried her to the bathroom, turning on the shower and adjusting the water to the right temperature before placing her down carefully. Without a word, he stepped back and closed the door behind him, giving her privacy. Back in the room, he grabbed a fresh black dress from the closet and set it on the bed. A moment later, Madam Agnes returned with a pack of pads. Jayson took one, placed it next to the dress, and then silently began stripping the stained bedsheets. Susanna didn't deserve to be uncomfortable. Once everything was set, he turned to Madam Agnes. "Take care of her," he said gruffly, "and if anything happens, get me." With that, he walked out of the room. Just as he stepped into the hallway, his phone rang. Glancing at the caller ID, he stiffened. His mother's doctor. His grip on the phone tightened as he picked up. "What is it?" A pause, then in a solemn tone, the doctor said, "Mr. Oputa, I'm sorry, your mother just passed away." Jayson froze. The world around him stood still. Jayson stood frozen in the hallway, the phone still pressed to his ear. But his mind had gone blank. "She's gone." The words echoed over and over in his head, yet they felt unreal. His mother, the only parent he had ever known, was no longer breathing. His grip on the phone tightened as he swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. He would not break. Not again. It had been 10 years since his world had shattered the first time. 10 years ago, when his twin sister, Chantel, had died in Italy during a skydiving accident. She had always been fearless, the wild one, always chasing danger like it was a game. And one day, the game turned deadly. Jayson still remembered the phone call, the way the air had left his lungs, the way his mother, who had been in Italy at the time, buying high-end materials for her business, had collapsed upon hearing the news. She never woke up. Just like that, she slipped into a coma, and for 10 years she had been lying in a hospital bed, breathing but not living. Her body was there, but she was gone, and now even that empty shell was no more. Jayson clenched his jaw, shoving his emotions deep where they couldn't touch him. There was no need to feel anything. His father had died when he was 5, his sister when he was 22. Now his mother was gone too. He was completely alone. Turning on his heel, he headed straight for his room, the only place where he could think. He walked onto his private balcony, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. He loosened the top buttons of his shirt, inhaling deeply. The city stretched before him bright, alive, chaotic, but inside he felt nothing. A few moments later, a familiar presence joined him. Felix, his right-hand man, the one person he trusted above all else. Felix stepped forward cautiously. "Sir, what happened?" Jayson let out a slow breath. "My mother is dead." Felix stilled, his usual stoic expression softening. He knew what Jayson's mother had meant to him, even in her unconscious state. "I'm sorry," Felix said sincerely. Jayson didn't acknowledge the words. "I'll be leaving for Italy this evening." Felix straightened. "Then I'll make the arrangements. I'll accompany you." "No." Jayson's tone was firm. Felix frowned. "Sir, it's not safe for you to travel alone." "I won't be alone." Felix's brows furrowed. "Who will be going with you?" Jayson turned his gaze back toward the city, his voice calm but decisive. "Susanna." Silence stretched between them before Felix finally spoke, his tone cautious. "Why?" Jayson exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't even sure himself. "There's something about her," he admitted. Felix's expression darkened slightly. This wasn't good. "Jayson, you know you can't afford to fall in love," Felix warned. "It will make you weak." Jayson let out a low chuckle. "I have no intentions of falling in love with Susanna." Felix raised an eyebrow. "Then what is this?" Jayson's jaw tightened. "I don't know," he admitted, "but she's coming with me." Felix sighed, shaking his head. He had seen this before. He knew that look in Jayson's eyes, and he knew whether Jayson admitted it or not. Susanna was already changing him. Jayson walked down the hallway with quiet determination, stopping in front of Susanna's door. He knocked lightly, expecting her to be silent, withdrawn, maybe even asleep. No response. With a small frown, he turned the knob and stepped inside. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Susanna was laughing. She was curled up on the bed, a small smile lighting up her face as she watched something on her iPad, completely unaware of his presence. For a moment, Jayson just stood there, watching her. She looked so different like this, carefree, unburdened by fear or anger. The sound of her laughter was something he hadn't expected to hear, not after everything that had happened between them. But then, as if sensing him, her gaze lifted, and just like that, her laughter vanished. Jayson blinked, bringing himself back to the moment. "Pack a bag," he said simply. "We're leaving for Italy." Susanna sat up straighter, confusion flickering across her face. "What?" "You heard me. Get ready." She shook her head instantly. "No, I'm not going anywhere with you." Jayson inhaled slowly, trying to hold on to the small amount of patience he had left. This was not the time for an argument, but when he saw the stubborn defiance in her eyes, something snapped. His entire demeanor darkened. His voice dropped. "Susanna, I own you." A shiver ran down her spine. "No one dares disobey me." He took a step closer. "Not even you." Tears welled in her eyes before she could control them. Fear gripped her chest, raw and consuming. Jayson's expression faltered slightly as he watched her body tremble, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. Her breathing became erratic, her lips quivering. She tried to hold it in, but the fear was too much. The tears spilled over. She broke. Jayson clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to seeing people cry, especially not because of him. "Damn it. Stop crying," he muttered, his tone lower now. "Right now." But she couldn't. She sniffled, her sobs quiet but heartbreaking. Jayson exhaled sharply and dipped his hand into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. Without a word, he extended it toward her. Susanna hesitated before taking it slowly, her fingers brushing against his. He turned away abruptly, already walking toward the door. "You have no choice," he said, his voice colder now. "You're coming with me." And then he left. An hour later, Jayson returned to her room, expecting to find her ready. She wasn't. She hadn't packed. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting on the bed, her eyes red from crying. Jayson's patience snapped. Without a word, he strode to the closet, grabbed a suitcase, and started throwing her clothes inside. Susanna watched in shock as he moved with sharp, precise movements, packing everything for her like she was a child. When he was done, he picked up the MacBook and iPhone he had given her, holding them in one hand. Then, before she could react, grabbed her. "Jayson!" she gasped. But it was too late. He lifted her over his shoulder like she weighed nothing. "Let me go," she yelled, pounding at his back. He didn't even flinch. Without breaking stride, he carried her out of the room, down the hallway, past Felix, who barely raised an eyebrow, and out of the house. A black car was already waiting, ready to take them to the private jet that awaited them. And no matter how much she fought, there was no escaping now. I sat stiffly in my seat, strapped in against my will, my arms crossed over my chest as I glared at nothing in particular. I hated him. I hated that he forced me to come. I hated him for taking me away from my life. And more than anything, I hated that I had no control. Muttering under my breath, I let out a frustrated sigh. "I don't even want to go to Italy." Jayson didn't respond. He sat 2 seats away, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his palms. For the first time since I had met him, he looked exhausted. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, in every way a person could be. I should have been glad to see him that way, but before I could hold on to that thought, one of his men leaned toward me, tapping my shoulder. "Boss just lost his mom," he said quietly. "Do well to stop pissing him off." I froze, my mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His mom? I looked at Jayson again. The way he sat so still, his fingers occasionally rubbing against his temples, his entire posture weighed down by something invisible. Suddenly, my anger faded. I knew what it was like to lose a mother, to wake up and know she's never coming back, to navigate life without her, knowing the one person who had once held you, protected you, loved you unconditionally was gone. A sharp pain twisted in my chest, and before I knew it, tears slipped down my cheeks. I wiped them away quickly, hoping no one saw, but Jayson did. Within seconds, he was beside me. The warmth of his presence startled me, and before I could process it, he gently pulled me toward him, guiding my head to his shoulder. I tensed. "Why are you comforting me?" "You're the one who just lost someone," I continued, my words almost a breath. He exhaled deeply, tilting his head slightly until it rested lightly against mine. "Maybe because you understand." I swallowed hard, and in that moment, I did. We were 2 people from different worlds, 2 souls who had been thrown together in the most unnatural of ways. But we shared one thing: loss. And for once, he wasn't the ruthless, untouchable Jayson Oputa. He was just a grieving man. My fingers curled slightly against my lap, my heart pounding in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. And then before I could process what was happening, his lips were on mine. It wasn't rough or forceful. It wasn't the kiss of a man who was trying to dominate or prove a point. It was slow, deep, raw. It felt real. My breath hitched, my body betraying me as my eyes fluttered shut, leaning into him. For a moment I forgot. I forgot who he was. I forgot how much I was supposed to hate him. I forgot that he had taken me from my life, from my father, from everything I knew. I forgot that I was supposed to push him away. But then reality crashed into me like a wave. I pulled back sharply, my breath ragged. Jayson opened his eyes, his expression unreadable. Silence filled the space between us, thick and heavy. What had I just done? What had we just done? I sat frozen in my seat, my heart still racing from the kiss. Why had it felt so right? I was supposed to hate him. I did hate him, and yet when his lips touched mine, I hadn't pulled away. I hadn't fought him. Instead, I had melted into him like I wanted it, like I wanted him. I clenched my fists, my chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. My emotions were tangled in ways I couldn't comprehend, a web of confusion, anger, and something far more dangerous, desire. I turned to him, my voice laced with frustration. "Is that it?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Because I was comforting you, you thought you could just kiss me?" Jayson exhaled, his eyes dark and unreadable as he ran a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I never want to do anything to you against your will." I blinked. That was not the response I was expecting. He didn't sound angry or defensive. He sounded genuine, and that threw me off balance. But I wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. I straightened my back, my voice cold. If that's the case, then why are you keeping me against my will? Jason's gaze didn't waver. If that's what you truly want, then when we return to Lagos, you're free to go. I froze. My heart stuttered in my chest. I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly. I searched his face for any sign that he was playing a cruel trick on me, but there was none. He was serious. You mean it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened slightly. I don't say things I don't mean. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. A slow warmth spread through my chest. Relief. For the first time since my father had handed me over to this man, I saw a light at the end of this nightmare. I was going to be free. I turned away, looking out of the jet's window, unable to stop the small, victorious smile that tugged at my lips. Soon this would all be over. But what unsettled me the most was the strange ache in my chest at the thought of leaving. The plane landed smoothly on a private airstrip, the golden hues of the evening sun spilling over the Italian landscape. The moment I stepped out of the jet, I lost my breath. Jayson's mansion in Tuscany was something straight out of a dream. Nestled amidst rolling hills and endless vineyards, it stood like a timeless masterpiece, a mix of old-world charm and modern luxury. The structure was grand, with tall archways, stone walls covered in ivy, and massive glass windows that reflected the setting sun. A long cobblestone driveway led up to the entrance, lined with towering cypress trees that whispered in the soft breeze. The air smelled of fresh earth, grapes, and a hint of lavender. It was nothing like the cold, intimidating mansion in Lagos. Here the air felt lighter. The landscape, the warmth of the sun, the breathtaking beauty, it felt almost magical. And for a moment, I forgot everything. I forgot who Jayson was. I forgot what had happened between us. I forgot that I was supposed to hate him. I turned slightly, my gaze flickering to Jayson. He was watching me. His hands were in his pockets, his posture relaxed, but his sharp eyes observed my reaction. He wasn't smirking, wasn't teasing me like I expected. Instead, his expression was different, almost as if he wanted me to love it here. "Welcome to Tuscany," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I swallowed, my lips parting slightly, unsure of what to say. Because for the first time since I was taken from my father, I didn't see a monster in front of me. I saw someone human, and that scared me more than anything. The moment we stepped into the mansion, I was completely in awe. It was nothing like I had imagined. I had expected something cold, impersonal, like the man who owned it. But this was breathtaking. Every inch of the estate was a masterpiece, a seamless blend of modern luxury and timeless elegance. The high ceilings stretched endlessly above, their intricate golden chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished marble floors. Sunlight streamed in through massive glass windows, bathing the space in a golden hue that made it feel almost unreal. Everything about this place screamed power, but strangely, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt warm, alive, beautiful. I trailed behind Jayson as he walked in, his presence as commanding as ever. But my focus was entirely on the architecture, the art, the history that seemed to whisper from the walls. I couldn't stop gasping. He said nothing, but I could feel his eyes flicker toward me every now and then, as if studying my reaction. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how impressed I was. Instead, I muttered, "It's all right, I guess." Jayson let out a small chuckle but said nothing. I needed water, something to cool the heat rising in my body. I walked straight to the kitchen, where sleek, modern appliances blended with the rustic, Italian-style design. The air smelled of fresh herbs, the faintest hint of wine and olive oil lingering. I grabbed a glass, filled it with water, and drank deeply. After calming myself, I made my way upstairs, eager to unpack and shut myself away from him. But as I climbed the staircase, my foot slipped. I let out a small gasp as I lost my balance, my body tilting dangerously forward. My heart leaped into my throat, but I caught myself. Gripping the railing just in time, I steadied my breath. Crisis averted. I shook my head at my own clumsiness and hurried the rest of the way up, finally reaching my room. I shut the door behind me, and let out a long sigh, finally alone. I unzipped my bag, pulling out fresh clothes. My body was exhausted from the long flight, and I desperately wanted to change into something more comfortable. Just as I reached for the hem of my dress, the door swung open. I turned sharply, my breath catching. Jayson stood there, wearing nothing but a towel. My entire body locked up. Dear God, I had seen him in his expensive suits, his crisp shirts, his usual powerful, intimidating attire. But this was dangerous. Water still clung to his broad shoulders, trailing down the rigid lines of his chest. His muscles flexed slightly with every breath, the towel hanging so low on his hips it was sinful. My mouth went dry. This was unfair. Jayson's dark eyes locked onto me, scanning me as if he could hear every thought racing through my mind. "I saw you trip on the cameras," he said, his voice smooth, too calm for the way my heart was hammering in my chest. "I came to check if you were okay." Cameras. So he was watching me. I swallowed hard, tearing my eyes away from his sculpted body. "I'm fine," I muttered, crossing my arms tightly over my chest. "You can leave now." He didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer. Too close. The air in the room shifted. Something thick and undeniable crackled between us, like a storm waiting to break. And before I could react, he grabbed me. My body crashed into his. My breath hitched. My hands instinctively landed on his bare chest. His skin was warm, firm, perfect. Jayson tilted his head, his gaze darkening. His lips hovered just inches from mine. "You want this, Susanna," he murmured, his voice so dangerously low it sent a shiver through me. My breath came fast, uneven, because for a brief second, I did. I wanted to feel him. I wanted to lose myself in him. I wanted no. I snapped back to reality, shaking my head furiously. "You said," I whispered, my voice breaking slightly, "you wouldn't do anything against my will." He stilled. For a moment, silence. Then, slowly, a smirk curved his lips. "You're right," he admitted, his voice taunting. "But very soon, you'll beg me to have you." My stomach dropped, because the worst part? He wasn't wrong. My body was already betraying me. I could feel the heat pooling deep in my belly, the tremble in my hands, the way my lips tingled from where I had imagined his. I wanted him, so badly, and that scared me more than anything. The next morning, Jayson left early. I had barely woken up when I heard the soft closing of the front doors downstairs, followed by the sound of cars pulling away from the mansion. I already knew where he was going, to the morgue, to collect his mother's body and take her to the mortuary. I had wanted to go with him. I wasn't sure why, but deep down I felt the need to be there for him. I knew what it was like to lose a mother, to have a part of your heart ripped away forever. Even though I didn't understand Jayson, even though he frustrated me to no end, I understood loss. But he wouldn't allow it. "This is dangerous," he had said last night when I tried to insist. His tone had been cold, final. "It's better if you stay home." I had wanted to argue, but his eyes told me it wasn't up for discussion. So I let him go. And I waited. Hours passed, and I found myself pacing in my room restless. Even though I told myself that I didn't care what happened to Jayson, I couldn't stop wondering how he was handling everything. A part of me thought he wouldn't even feel anything. But another part, the part that had seen the way his face darkened at the mention of his sister, the way his voice cracked ever so slightly when he spoke about his mother's coma, knew that wasn't true. Jayson did feel things. He just didn't know how to show them. When he finally returned later that afternoon, the air around him felt different. The moment I saw him, I knew something had shifted. Jayson walked past everyone without saying a word. His usually sharp, calculating eyes were darker, heavier, as if he was carrying something no one could understand. His suit was still perfect, his posture still held the same power, but he was different. He looked like a man who had just buried the last piece of his heart. And maybe that's exactly what had happened. I hesitated for a long moment before gathering the courage to approach him. He was in his study, standing by the large window, staring out at the vineyards, his hands shoved into his pockets. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. "Jayson," I called softly. He didn't turn. I swallowed. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for your loss." The moment the words left my mouth, he turned sharply. His face was furious. "I don't want your sympathy." His words lashed through me, sharp and cutting. I flinched, my heart pounding. "I was just trying to—" "You were just trying to what?" His voice rose, his chest rising and falling with restrained fury. His eyes burned into me. "You don't know anything about me, Susanna," he spat. "You're just a distraction." A distraction. The words hit me like a slap. My throat tightened as I took a step back. "I didn't ask for this," I whispered, my voice trembling. Jayson exhaled sharply, gripping the back of his neck. His jaw clenched, his frustration bleeding into the air between us. "Just go away." I stood frozen. For a moment, the silence between us was thick, suffocating. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had only tried to be there, but he didn't want me here? Fine. Then I would leave. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked out, my chest tight with emotions I didn't understand. I stormed up to my room, anger and hurt coiling inside me. I hadn't done anything to him. I had only tried to help. If he didn't want me around, then I wouldn't be around. I grabbed my passport, stuffed my credit card into my pocket, and without even packing a bag, I left the mansion. The streets were quieter than I expected. The air was cool, carrying the scent of vineyards and freshly baked bread from nearby cafes. The roads stretched long and empty, the only sounds coming from the occasional passing car. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from him. From his moods, from his unpredictability, from the way he made me feel things I shouldn't be feeling. The streets of Tuscany were beautiful, lined with cobblestone walkways and old rustic buildings, but I barely paid attention. I had made it 2 blocks away when I felt it. A shift in the air. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. Before I could turn around, a black van screeched to a stop beside me. My body froze in terror. Doors slammed open. Footsteps rushed toward me. A rough hand clamped over my mouth. I tried to scream. I tried to fight, but it was too late. Something sharp pressed against my neck. I felt a sting, then a sudden, numbing coldness spread through my veins. My body went weak. My vision blurred. The last thing I heard was the sound of tires screeching, the van door slamming shut, and then darkness. Jayson woke up with a deep sense of regret sitting heavy on his chest. The first thing his mind registered was her. Susanna. He had been cruel to her last night. Too cruel. She had only been trying to comfort him, and instead of letting her in, even just for a second, he had pushed her away. "You're just a distraction." The words replayed in his mind, and a bitter taste filled his mouth. What the hell was wrong with him? He had never been the type of man to care about how his words affected someone. But with Susanna, it was different. Because she was different. Raking a hand through his hair, he climbed out of bed, determined to fix things. He needed to see her. He needed to apologize. Jayson strode down the hall, his steps purposeful. When he reached her door, he knocked once. No answer. His brows furrowed slightly. He knocked again, this time louder. Still no answer. A strange unease curled in his gut. "Susanna," he called. Silence. Without thinking twice, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was untouched. There were no clothes thrown around, no signs that she had even been there. Jayson's pulse spiked. He stepped further inside, scanning every inch of the space, his sharp eyes catching the small details. Her passport was missing. A single drawer had been left slightly open, as if she had grabbed something in a hurry. His jaw clenched. She left. She left him. A muscle ticked in his jaw as realization sank in. But something didn't feel right. If Susanna had planned to leave, she would have taken more than just her passport. A flicker of something dangerous lit up in his chest as he spun on his heel and stormed toward his study. His gut was telling him something was wrong, and he had learned a long time ago his instincts were never wrong. Jayson reached his study and immediately pulled up the security footage. He watched as Susanna walked out of the mansion, alone, his fists clenched at the sight of her walking into the dark streets, unprotected. Then just 2 blocks away from the estate, a black van screeched to a stop beside her. His breath hitched. He watched, his blood turning to ice as masked men rushed out, grabbed her, and forced her into the vehicle. Her struggle was brief. One of them pressed something against her neck, and then she went still. His vision blurred with red-hot rage. Jayson slammed his fist against the desk, the sound echoing through the room. He felt sick. Someone had taken his woman. He rewound the footage, focusing on the men. The logo on the van, the way they moved, it all pointed to one person, his rival. Jayson's lips curled into a snarl. He had heard whispers that Alexander Ricci was in town, a man just as ruthless as Jayson, a man who had wanted to destroy him for years. And now, he had taken the one thing Jayson couldn't afford to lose, Susanna. Jayson's entire body was coiled with rage. He had lost his mother, he had lost his sister, but he would not lose Susanna. His chest rose and fell heavily as he grabbed his phone, his voice deadly cold as he spoke. "Felix, we move now, because Jayson didn't just need to get her back. He needed to burn everything Alexander Ricci had ever touched to the ground." Jayson had never felt fear like this before. Rage? Yes. Control? Always. But fear? Never. Not until now. Not until he saw Susanna's terrified face on the CCTV footage, the way she had struggled as she was dragged into that van. He gripped the steering wheel tightly as the black SUV sped through the dark streets, his heart pounding in his chest. He was going to get her back, even if it killed him. Felix sat in the passenger seat, his gun loaded, his expression grim. "Boss, are you sure about this? Damien isn't someone we can just walk up to and demand things from." Jayson's eyes burned with fury. "I don't care if I have to rip his entire operation apart, Felix." His voice was dangerously low. "I'm getting her back." Felix nodded. He knew better than to argue. The abandoned warehouse was exactly what Jayson had expected, a trap. Damien had made sure of it. The moment Jayson and his men stormed inside, bullets rained down on them. Jayson dodged behind a stack of wooden crates, his gun drawn, firing back with precision. His men covered him as they fought their way inside. The air was thick with gunpowder, shouts, and the metallic scent of blood. He didn't care about any of it. His only focus was her. And then he saw her. Susanna. She was tied to a chair, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. She was alive. His chest tightened painfully with relief. But before he could move toward her, a fist slammed into his face. Jayson staggered backward as Damien's men closed in on him. A punch to his ribs, a kick to his leg, a brutal hit to his jaw. Pain exploded in his body, but he didn't stop. He fought back with everything he had, throwing punches, dodging blows. But he was outnumbered. Another hit to his ribs, another to his face. His vision blurred, blood trickling from his temple. Susanna screamed, "Jayson!" His name on her lips sent a surge of adrenaline through him. He wasn't going to lose. Not when she was right there. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he swung his elbow into the nearest man's face, knocking him out cold. He grabbed another by the neck and slammed him into the wall. Gunshots rang through the air as his men took down the rest. And then it was over. Damien was nowhere to be found, having escaped like a coward. Jayson, bruised and bloody, stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees in front of Susanna. His shaking hands untied the ropes around her wrists. She was crying, tears streaming down her face. And then she was in his arms. Jayson wrapped her tightly against him, holding her like he never wanted to let go. His entire body shook with emotion. And then he broke. Tears spilled down his face as he clutched her desperately. I thought I lost you, Susanna, he whispered, his voice breaking. Her fingers curled into his torn shirt. I, I thought you wouldn't come, she sobbed. Jayson pulled back slightly, cradling her face between his bloodied hands. His eyes, filled with pain, love, and desperation, burned into hers. I love you, Susanna. Her breath hitched. His voice was raw, broken. I don't know when it happened, but I know I can't lose you. You're all I want. You're all I have. She stared at him, shocked, overwhelmed. I never planned this, he whispered, tears still falling. I never planned to fall for you. But I did. I love you. And I will never let anything happen to you again. Susanna's heart pounded wildly. Jayson Oputa, the man she had once feared, the man she had once thought incapable of love, was crying for her, and deep down in the pit of her soul, she knew she had fallen for him too. The return to the mansion was silent. Susanna sat beside Jayson in the back of the black SUV, watching him as he rested his head against the seat. His knuckles were bruised, his jaw cut, and deep purple bruises lined his ribs. But even in pain, he held himself together, strong, unreadable. But she knew better now. She knew that beneath his hardened exterior, he was breaking. Jayson Oputa, the ruthless, feared man, had risked everything for her. He had come for her. And now, she couldn't bring herself to walk away anymore. They arrived back at the Tuscan estate just before sunset. The golden light stretched over the hills, the sky painted in soft pinks and oranges. But Susanna barely noticed. The moment they stepped inside, she turned to him, her heart pounding. You need to let me take care of you. Jayson raised a brow, a small smirk twitching at the corner of his lips despite his injuries. Worried about me now, are you? She crossed her arms, glaring at him. Sit down. Surprisingly, he obeyed. She knelt in front of him, grabbing the first aid kit that Felix had brought in. Gently, she dabbed at the wounds on his face, wiping away the dried blood. His sharp eyes never left her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she cleaned his bruised jaw. Does it hurt? She whispered. He let out a low chuckle. Only when you're not touching me. Her heart skipped a beat. Damn him. She swallowed hard, focusing on the task at hand. But as she worked, she became painfully aware of how close they were. His scent leather, spice, and something distinctly him, wrapped around her. His gaze followed her every movement, burning into her. She could still feel the phantom touch of his hands from the night in her bedroom, the way her body had responded so easily to him. And it terrified her. When she was done, she stood up quickly, creating distance between them. We should get ready. We're leaving for Lagos tonight. Jayson nodded, his eyes unreadable. But as she turned to leave, his fingers wrapped around her wrist, stopping her. Sussy. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat because he had never called her that before. And the way he said itlo, rough, intimate, sent shivers down her spine. She turned slowly, looking down at him. His grip was loose, but his eyes held her in place. You don't have to leave, he said softly. She didn't respond, because she didn't know if she could. Jayson's condition improved after a few days, but Susanna never left his bedside. She told herself it was because she wanted to make sure he was okay, but deep down, she knew better. She wanted to be near him. She wanted him. Her feelings for him terrified her. She had spent weeks hating him, fighting him, but somehow she had fallen for him instead, and there was no denying it anymore. That night, she lay beside him in bed, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting silver shadows over his face. She reached out slightly, brushing away a stray lock of hair from his forehead. When did this happen? When did she start needing him this much? Her eyelids grew heavy, and soon, sleep pulled her under. Warm lips pressed against her neck, trailing soft kisses down her skin. Her eyes fluttered open, and her breath caught. Jayson. His strong arms were wrapped around her waist, his body pressed against her back, his lips hot and teasing against her pulse point. She didn't stop him. because she didn't want to. She had been craving this, craving him for days now. A soft moan escaped her lips as his kisses grew deeper, more urgent. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her skin. His voice was rough, strained. She turned to face him, her fingers sliding into his hair. "Don't stop." And that was all it took. Jayson claimed her. His lips crashed against hers, and she kissed him back with a hunger that had been building for far too long. Their bodies tangled in the sheets, fire meeting fire, desire meeting desire. That night he made soul-wrenching love to her, and Susanna knew there was no going back. Jayson sat in his study, a deep frown creasing his forehead. The private investigator he had hired stood in front of him, his expression grim. Jayson already knew what was coming. Bad news. Susanna's father. It had taken weeks of tracking, digging through old military records, and following the smallest leads. But the truth was now laid out before him, and it wasn't what he had hoped for. The investigator exhaled before speaking. "Sir, after extensive searching, we found records of Susanna's real father. His name was Colonel Gabriel Okafor. He was a decorated soldier in the Nigerian army. But," he hesitated. Jayson's jaw clenched. "But what?" "He died in war 5 years ago." Silence. Jayson leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. Dead. That meant Susanna had no one. No father, no mother, no family left. Something in his chest tightened painfully. Jayson didn't usually care about other people's emotions, but when it came to her, things were different, and he knew this would break her. He tapped his fingers against the desk, processing the information before nodding. "Send me all the records. I'll tell her myself." The investigator nodded and left. Jayson sat there for a long time, staring at the folder that contained the truth about Susanna's past. But before he told her, there was one more thing he needed to do. He reached into his drawer and pulled out her nursing school admission letter. He had found it a few days ago while she was still sleeping, folded neatly among her things, and now everything had been taken care of. The tuition, the accommodations, the paperwork. When the new semester began, she would be able to start immediately. Because if there was one thing Jayson Oputa was certain of, it was this: he would give Susanna everything she ever wanted, even if she didn't realize it yet. Jayson found Susanna in the garden, watching the sunset. The soft hues of orange and pink cast a glow on her skin, making her look almost angelic. For a brief second, he just stood there watching her. How had she become so important to him? How had she, the woman he once bought in a deal, become the one thing he couldn't live without? Shaking the thought away, he walked over and sat beside her. She turned to him, surprised. "You're not usually a fan of quiet places like this," she teased. Jayson smirked slightly but didn't reply. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "I found your father." Susanna's smile faded instantly, her hands clenched in her lap. "My real father?" she whispered. Jayson nodded, his voice softer than usual. "Yes." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then slowly she turned to face him. "Where is he?" Jayson hesitated. He hated delivering bad news, but she deserved the truth. "He was a soldier, Susanna." Jayson's voice was careful, measured. "A highly decorated colonel in the Nigerian army. He was a good man." Her lips parted slightly, her breath coming faster. A soldier. Her real father was a soldier. She had spent years wondering where she came from, who she truly was, and now she finally had an answer. Jayson's voice dropped even lower. "He died in war 5 years ago." The words shattered her. She sucked in a breath, her body stiffening as she processed it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She wouldn't cry. She had already lost one father, the man who raised her. Now she had lost another, the one she never even got to meet. Jayson watched her closely, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. And then, as if sensing that she needed something to hold on to, he handed her the envelope. She looked at him, confused. "What's this?" "Open it," he said simply. Her fingers trembled as she tore the envelope open. The moment she saw the letter, her breath caught in her throat. It was her admission letter. the same one she had read 1,000 times, dreaming about the future she thought she lost. But there was something different. A new stamp, a confirmation of full payment. A trembling hand covered her mouth as she looked up at Jayson, shocked. "You paid for everything?" she whispered. Jayson nodded. "You can start when the semester resumes." Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She didn't know what to feel, heartbroken or grateful. She had lost a father, but she had gained something else. A future. A dream that wasn't lost anymore. And standing in front of her was the man who had made it happen. She stared at Jayson, her chest aching, her emotions tangled in a way she couldn't explain. This man, the one she had hated, the one who had once held her against her will, had become the only person she had left. Her fingers clenched the letter tightly. She had no one else in the world, only him. And for the first time, she realized something. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Months passed like a dream. Susanna started nursing school, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she had a purpose, a dream that was finally coming true. Every morning she woke up in Jayson's arms, feeling safe, cherished, wanted. And every evening she came home to him, telling him about her classes, her experiences, her passion for helping people. Jayson listened to every word. The ruthless, untouchable man who once lived only for power and control now lived for her. He was her protector, her supporter, her confidant. And more than anything, he was her man. Jayson Oputa had built a world where love had no place. He had spent years closing himself off, believing emotions made him weak. But with Susanna, everything changed. She became his weakness, his lover, his everything. In a world where people feared him, she was the only one who saw through him. And he gave all of himself to her. No secrets, no masks. Just Jayson. For the first time in his life, he was free. Free to love. Free to be loved. Their love grew, flourished, became unbreakable. It was in the way he held her at night, whispering words only meant for her. It was in the way she challenged him, softened him, loved him. It was in the way he became a better man, just for her. There was no longer any question. She was his and he was hers, forever. The end. 4-0.